In the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, a small lifeboat drifted helplessly beneath the burning sun. On board were 4 men, including a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker. It was 1884, and their vessel, the Mignonette, had gone down in a sudden storm, leaving them stranded more than 1,000 miles from land. The chaos of the wreck left them with almost no supplies, no fresh water, and the only food was a few turnips. As the weeks dragged on, the men became skeletal, dehydrated, and starved. They knew time was running out, and that survival might mean sacrificing one of their own. This is the story of the Mignonette, a nightmare that unfolded in real time, and one you don't want to miss out on. It was 1884, and a yacht called the Mignonette had left Southampton, England. It was bound for Sydney, Australia, but this boat was fragile and only 50 feet long. This vessel was meant for short coastal trips, never for the open ocean. But this yacht had been purchased by an Australian who wanted her delivered halfway across the world. Hiring a crew was actually cheaper than shipping the yacht on a larger vessel, but it meant gambling with human lives. 4 men would set out: Captain Tom Dudley, a seasoned sailor, his mate Edwin Stephens, an older seaman named Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old named Richard Parker. He was young, eager, and inexperienced. Parker joined the voyage as a chance to see the world. The route they planned would take them down the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and across to Australia, a staggering distance for such a small boat. The only reassurance was that they would pass along regular shipping lanes where other vessels could be spotted if disaster struck. And these men quickly realized that disaster was never far away. The Mignonette carried no cargo and little in the way of provisions. Her only backup was a 13-foot dinghy, which was an open boat, scarcely big enough for the 4 men. It had no shelter and no real stores. It was simply meant to keep them afloat in case of emergency. It seemed that from the very start, this voyage was laden with risk. And unfortunately, it wouldn't take long for the men to realize how dangerous things could get. For weeks, the Mignonette pressed southward into the Atlantic swells. At first, the weather was fair, but the strain soon showed. Her seams groaned and her timbers flexed with every wave. Every day, she would fill with water, and the men would have to bail it out. The yacht meant for sheltered waters was really beginning to reveal her limitations, and the men knew it. And then, on July 5th, 1884, the wind picked up and the seas rose. And by that afternoon, the yacht was fighting for every mile. And out of the storm, a wall of sea suddenly towered above them. A monstrous wave crashed onto the deck, smashing through the planking, tearing a gaping hole in her side. Water poured in, and Dudley shouted frantically from the stern. Stephens scrambled to free the dinghy, while Brooks tried to plug the holes, but it was no use. Parker had to cling to the rigging just so he wasn't swept away. This is when they realized the Mignonette was fatally wounded, and within minutes of that wave, she was sinking. The crew shoved the dinghy into the surf, and 4 men tumbled into that 13-foot boat, only able to drag with them 2 tins of preserved turnips, and literally nothing else. No water, no charts, and nothing to give them shelter from the sun, and nothing to keep them warm when it got cold. Here they were in just an open dinghy on the vast and merciless sea. And in that moment, as 17-year-old Richard Parker looked back to see their ship vanish, he couldn't have known what terror was in front of him. In the first hours after the Mignonette went under, the 4 men sat stunned in the little dinghy, drenched, shivering, and staring out at the end of the sea. The situation was dawning on them, that they were only able to grab this little tiny bit of food, and that certainly wasn't going to be enough to sustain them. They knew they could be adrift for a while, and their only hope would be to flag down a passing vessel. But they knew if that didn't work, they were going to need to ration what little food they had, the 2 tins of turnips. Each one barely a pound. It ended up being a sliver of turnip here and a sliver of turnip there. Just enough to quiet the gnawing in their stomachs. But these alone wouldn't keep them alive for long. Their bodies were beginning to crave water, and the ocean all around them offered none. And by the end of their first week adrift, these men were already wasting away. Then, in a stroke of luck, a sea turtle surfaced near the dinghy. With a sudden energy, the men burst into action and hunting the turtle down. They hauled it aboard immediately. This turtle was literally a lifesaver. They cut open the shell, could take out the intestines and throw them in the water, and drank the blood for fluid. They would slowly carve strips of meat to sustain themselves. The bones in the shell were left to dry, and later they would gnaw even those for scraps of nourishment. For a short time, the turtle gave them strength. But it was only one animal, and once gone, there was nothing to replace it. By the second week, water was the greater torment. Sometimes the rain clouds that passed overhead gave them a glimmer of hope as they tried to catch droplets and scraps of cloth or run their tongues along planks of the dinghy, trying to get whatever little bit they could, but it was nowhere near enough, especially not to match the heat of the midday sun that they constantly battled. And as their thirst deepened, the men turned to desperate measures. They even licked condensation that would form on the wood of the boat. They began to drink their own urine, knowing it would only dehydrate them further. At this point, their lips were split, their gums were bleeding, and the tongues were swollen so badly that they could barely speak. Richard Parker suffered the worst. At only 17, he didn't have the knowledge of the sea like the older men. They had warned him not to drink seawater, but in his desperation, he made a fatal mistake. He quickly downed a mouthful of the salty brine, and at first, it seemed to relieve his thirst, but it wasn't long after he began to vomit. The salt had drew moisture from his cells and ended up sending him into convulsions. His belly swelled, and his mind from here on would grow cloudy. It said that he would drift in and out of delirium, and unfortunately, the only thing that could save him now was fresh water, and it seemed nowhere to be found. To make things even worse, the ocean began to offer up a new way to die. Sharks began to surround the dinghy, with their fins slicing through the surface. It may have been the remains of the turtle that attracted them, or even the boat itself as a tiny new structure in the empty ocean. This was terribly frightening for the men because the boat was creaking with every wave, and they knew that at any minute a rogue wave could tear this thing apart and leave them helpless to the sharks. I just want to take a moment and drop in and say, don't leave me helpless to the sharks. Extend a hand and consider subscribing to the channel if you like the content, and maybe share it with someone you know. And if this content is not for you, that's okay. Just enjoy the episode, and I'll be back most weeks with other crazy survival stories that I hope you'll like. With that, I'll move on. Thank you. By the third week adrift, hope for the men was starting to slip away. At one point, a sail flickered on the horizon. They screamed and waved desperately until their throats burned, but the ship would pass on too far to notice. At other times, clouds would build up and rain would fall nearby, and they could see it on the horizon. They sat there dumbfounded as they held out scraps of cloths in their cupped hands, waiting for the downpour just to watch it sweep past just over the horizon. This happened again and again until the men's hope started to slip away. Day by day, these men knew that their fate was heading towards fatality. And for Richard Parker, who was already poisoned by the seawater, he became too weak to talk and too weak to even move. His stomach was swollen, his lips turned black, and his skin blistered and peeled from the sun. Each shallow breath rattled in his chest. To the men around him, his decline was no longer just a tragedy, it was an opportunity. Because that's when Dudley and Stephens began to speak openly about the old sailor's code, the custom of the sea. In other wrecks, when all hope was gone, lots were drawn. In accordance with maritime tradition, in desperate times, whoever would draw the short straw would sacrifice himself for the rest of the crew to eat, to be cannibalized so that the others may live. Now, this was actually fairly common in those days, which I covered in an episode about the vessel the Essex, where the men ended up eating one of their own. But this is truly a barbaric thing that happened, but it was very real, and sometimes there was no other way to survive but then to eat some of your own crew. It was a brutal way to go, but it was impartial. It carried out a vague appearance of justice for those who fell victim to it. But here, the men decided no lots would be drawn. There would be no fairness. Because Dudley and Stephens essentially decided, why draw lots and risk one of the healthy men with kids being sacrificed for the rest when Parker was likely to die anyway? And in that moment, the line between survival and murder was crossed. And Parker must have sensed it, even in his delirium, because the boat had gone silent. He could feel the ways that their eyes lingered on them, and even though he was 17, he understood the capabilities of men. He knew being the weakest, trapped in a boat with 3 starving men, was a position nobody would want to find themselves in, and he was way too weak to resist. I couldn't imagine the dread in his mind, knowing that not only was his life slipping away, but that the men around him were about to expedite that. And on July 25th, Dudley leaned over to Parker. He muttered a final prayer for forgiveness, then drove his knife into the boy's throat. What followed was a literal frenzy. They stabbed him multiple times to make sure that he was dead, in their minds giving him the quickest death as possible. They immediately began to drink his blood for fluid and would go on to take pieces of his flesh to sustain themselves. They couldn't stand to look at Parker's face anymore, as they had to essentially butcher this poor kid. So they did the unthinkable. They literally cut his head off and threw it in the ocean. And it wasn't long before the sharks literally devoured this poor kid's head. In that boat, no one's hands remained clean. Everybody feasted upon their freshly dead crewmate, but little words were said. For the next 4 days, the men would consume Parker's body. Each bite was both salvation and damnation, proof how far they had fallen. His death may have bought their lives, but likely at a cost that could never be undone. By the end of July, even after having Parker's body to consume, the men were still on the brink of death. They were dehydrated and malnourished. They had drifted more than 1,000 miles across the South Atlantic in that tiny boat. They were starved, skeletal, and barely conscious. They were more ghosts than men. But on July 29th, salvation appeared on the horizon. The German bark Moctezuma spotted the dinghy and drew near. The men were immediately hauled on board, given food and water to finally end their ordeal. Relief surged to the men, but it didn't last. All of them had known what they did, and they knew that England might not forgive this desperation, because after all, they opted not to follow the maritime code of drawing lots, which was a way to kind of make this cannibalism legal in those times. They knew that the truth hung over them like a shadow, even when they landed back at Falmouth, England. Word spread quickly. At first, the locals were curious and eager to hear about the wreck and their survival at sea, but soon whispers began. Whispers that the men had not lived on luck, but on the body of the cabin boy. This wasn't a tale of endurance, it was something a little darker. When the naval courts heard of Dudley and Stephens' transgressions, they were charged with murder, and Brooks, who refused to strike the blow, was actually spared and brought forward as a witness. Brooks, who at the time protested the boy's death, was spared and brought forward as a witness. Now, Dudley and Stephens never covered up the fact that they had killed this boy and why they did it. So the trial became not so much a question of whether they were guilty, it was whether or not their actions were reasonable, considering they diverted from the custom of the sea. It had long been okay to draw lots, to sacrifice or kill another person on board. However, these men chose for themselves. Though, given the circumstances, it may or may not have been the right thing to do. And actually, unbelievably, these guys had a lot of public support at the time. Not only public support, actually support from Richard Parker's brother, who believed that the men's actions was reasonable given the situation. And Chief Justice Coleridge, who oversaw the case, would give a ruling that would echo for generations. Necessity, no matter how dire, could never excuse the taking of an innocent life, and especially not the life of a child. If desperation justified murder, he warned, then nobody would be safe. And the court found Dudley and Stephens guilty. By law, the sentence was death. And as the two men were led away to the gallows, the Crown stepped up almost immediately and commuted their punishment. They ended up serving 6 months in prison, which is more of a symbol than a sentence. And I understand this. I understand why the courts would convict these guys, because whether or not they were completely justified in ending this young man's life, given that it was already probably going to die, if it was true, there's no chance for justice. It would open the door for people to do all kinds of dark things, and you don't want to set that precedent, especially considering that the only version of events and the only person that could speak for Richard Parker was the people that killed him. And that right there is something that makes me a little suspect right from the start. But for Richard Parker, unfortunately, this sentence offered no reprieve, and his death ended up becoming a turning point in the law. Because for years, the courts in England and abroad had overlooked the custom of the sea, refusing to prosecute people who engage with either drawing lots and ultimately murdering somebody to feed the rest of the crew. But from this point on, England would deem this an illegal custom. And whether drawing lots or deciding amongst the crew who should die, none of that would be allowed anymore. If you're going to cannibalize somebody from this point on, well, they better already be dead. After the trial, and after their sentence, Dudley and Stephens returned to obscurity, forever shadowed by what they had done. They told their version that Parker was delirious, dying, and that necessity left them no choice. But for some, it was a convenient story, because we all know that two grown men could easily have overpowered a sickly 17-year-old, and they chose not to draw lots. Whether out of selfishness, desperation, or both, the truth of that day will never fully be known. And not to mention, I wonder about Brooks sometimes. There is a certain guilt by not doing something to stop what transpired in that boat. I don't know if that completely absolves him as a guilty party here, but the court saw otherwise. After all was said and done, Parker was memorialized in Southampton. What a dark but interesting story. It really shows how people can react again in these extreme survival situations. And I just want to say thank you for listening in this week or watching. And a reminder that you can find us both on Spotify and YouTube. And with that, I will be out of your hair. See you again next week. Thank you.